Business before war. In the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler did not rise to power with tanks or armies. He rose with contracts. Germany was bankrupt, humiliated, and technologically behind. Its factories stood idle. Its currency was weak. Its military was restricted by international treaties. What the Nazi regime needed first was not soldiers. It needed machines, fuel, data, and credit. And much of that came from outside Germany. Long before the first shot was fired in September 1939, American companies were already present inside the German economy. Not as secret conspirators, not as ideologues, but as partners. They built factories, transferred patents, optimized production, and modernized logistics, all legally, all documented, all profitable. At the time, these deals were framed as normal business. The United States was officially neutral. Germany was a sovereign state. Contracts were contracts. Executives spoke the language of markets, not morality. They warned of communism, praised efficiency, and insisted that politics should not interfere with trade. In boardrooms and banking offices, Hitler was not yet seen as a warlord. He was seen as a stabilizer, a man who restored order, a customer who paid. By the time the world understood what Nazi Germany was becoming, the infrastructure was already in place. Factories that produced civilian vehicles could be converted into military plants within weeks. Technologies designed for accounting could be repurposed for control and classification. Fuel innovations meant to increase efficiency made mechanized warfare possible. When war finally came, it did not start from nothing. It started on assembly lines that were already running, on systems that had already been tested, on networks that had already been financed. This story is not about ideology. It is not about secret plots or hidden loyalties. It is about choices. Choices made in the 1920s and 1930s by American corporations that believed business could remain neutral, even as their partners prepared for war. They did not pull the trigger, but they helped load the machine, and once it was running, no one could stop it. Ford Motor Company, trucks for the Reich. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, Ford was already there. The American automaker had entered the German market years earlier. In 1925, Ford Work AG was established in Cologne. What began as a civilian manufacturing operation quickly grew into one of the most modern automotive plants in the country. By the early 1930s, it was producing tens of thousands of vehicles a year and employing thousands of German workers. This was not a marginal subsidiary. Ford Work was a strategic industrial asset. As the Nazi regime began rearming Germany, initially in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, mobility became a priority. Modern warfare required logistics, trucks to move troops, fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Germany lacked the industrial base to meet this demand quickly on its own. Ford filled that gap. By the mid-1930s, Ford Work was producing trucks that were soon integrated into Germany's rearmament program. These vehicles would later become standard transport for the Wehrmacht, especially during the early years of the war, when speed and coordination defined German military success. This was not hidden activity. It was not covert. It was industrial production in plain sight. At the center of this relationship stood Henry Ford himself. Ford was not an obscure executive detached from his overseas operations. He maintained close control over his company and was internationally famous, not only as an industrial innovator, but also for his outspoken political views. His anti-Semitic writings were widely circulated in Germany and praised by Nazi leaders, including Hitler. In 1938, the German government awarded Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the Order of the German Eagle, the highest decoration Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. The medal was presented on Ford's 75th birthday. It was a public gesture, signaling mutual respect between the regime and the industrialist. The award did not require Ford's factories to build weapons directly. It reflected something broader. Ford represented modern industrial power, mass production, and efficiency, the very qualities the Nazi state sought to harness. Before the outbreak of war in 1939, Ford Werk officially produced civilian vehicles. But the distinction between civilian and military production was thin. Trucks designed for commercial transport were easily adapted for military use. Once the war began, Ford factories in Germany and occupied France were fully absorbed into the wartime economy. Vehicles produced in Ford plants were used to support invasions across Europe, including Poland and France. American ownership did not stop this process. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, communication between Ford's U.S. headquarters and its German subsidiary ceased. But the factories themselves did not stop operating. They were now part of the Nazi war machine, producing under German control using American designs and industrial methods. The infrastructure had already been built. The expertise had already been transferred. The trucks were already rolling. After 1945, the story took another turn. Ford Motor Company submitted claims to the U.S. government for damages to its German plants caused by Allied bombing. These claims were approved. The company received compensation for facilities that, during the war, had produced vehicles for the enemy. No executives were tried. No criminal charges were filed. The relationship was reframed as an unfortunate consequence of global business. Legally, Ford had violated no U.S. law before America entered the war. Morally, the question remained unanswered. Ford did not invent Nazi militarism, but its factories helped make it mobile, and in modern warfare, mobility is everything. IBM, data, control, and the architecture of the Reich. Modern war is not fought by weapons alone. It is fought by information. Before Nazi Germany could deport, mobilize, or exploit millions of people, it first had to identify, classify, and track them. That required something the Reich did not yet possess: a fast, scalable system for managing massive amounts of data. That system came from America. IBM did not operate in Germany directly. Instead, it worked through its German subsidiary, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, better known as DHMAG. DHMAG supplied punch card tabulating machines, early data processing systems capable of sorting and cross-referencing millions of records with unprecedented speed. These machines were already used worldwide for censuses, insurance records, and industrial planning. In Germany, they became something else. By the early 1930s, DHMAG machines were embedded in key state institutions, including statistical offices and government ministries. When the Nazi regime took power in 1933, it inherited not only the bureaucracy of the Weimar Republic, but also its data infrastructure. The new regime immediately expanded it. One of the first large-scale uses of punch card technology under Nazi rule was the national census. The 1933 and 1939 censuses were not simple head counts. They included detailed questions on religion, ancestry, profession, language, and place of residence. The data was processed using DHMAG machines, allowing officials to rapidly identify specific groups within the population: Jews, Roma, political opponents, disabled citizens. Each category could be isolated, cross-referenced, and mapped. This was not guesswork. It was bureaucracy powered by machines. IBM's technology did not issue orders. It did not write laws. But it made the Nazi state efficient. And efficiency was essential to persecution on a national scale. As Germany rearmed, punch card systems were increasingly used beyond censuses. They were applied to industrial planning, labor allocation, transportation logistics, tracking of forced labor. Millions of foreign workers and prisoners were integrated into the German war economy. Managing them required constant updates: where they were, what they did, how productive they were, and when they were no longer useful. The machines handled this workload far faster than human clerks ever could. Dehomag technicians serviced the equipment. Punch cards were customized. Systems were updated. These services continued until the United States entered the war in December 1941. IBM headquarters in New York maintained tight control over its subsidiaries worldwide. Contracts, patents, and machine leasing were centrally managed. Dehomag did not own its machines outright. They were leased, maintained, and upgraded under IBM's business model. There is no evidence that IBM executives ordered or designed crimes. There is also no evidence that they were unaware of how their technology was being used. What is documented is this: IBM continued its relationship with Dehomag throughout the 1930s, even as Nazi racial laws intensified and rearmament accelerated. The business was legal. The profits were real. The consequences were catastrophic. Unlike some other companies, IBM was never prosecuted after the war. Investigations raised questions, journalists uncovered documents, and historians debated responsibility, but no formal charges followed. The reason was simple. Technology is neutral under the law. A machine that counts people is not legally responsible for what happens to them afterward. But history does not operate by legal definitions alone. Without fast, centralized data processing, the Nazi state would have faced enormous obstacles in implementing its policies. Chaos slows persecution. Inefficiency creates gaps. Errors allow people to disappear. IBM's technology closed those gaps. It turned ideology into administration, hatred into procedure, murder into paperwork. And once that system existed, it no longer mattered who had invented it. Standard Oil, fuel, patents, and the engine of blitzkrieg armies do not move on ideology. They move on fuel. Germany entered the 1930s with a fatal weakness. It had almost no domestic oil. Any long war would strangle the Reich within months, unless it solved the energy problem first. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, everything depended on a steady supply of fuel Germany simply did not possess. The solution was not conquest. It was chemistry. The cornerstone of Germany's fuel strategy was synthetic oil, fuel produced from coal through complex chemical processes. This technology was developed and scaled by IG Farben, the giant industrial cartel at the heart of the Nazi war economy. But IG Farben did not work in isolation. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, it maintained extensive patent sharing and technology agreements with Standard Oil of New Jersey, today Exxon. These agreements covered crucial innovations, including synthetic fuel production, fuel additives, methods to improve aviation gasoline performance. Under these contracts, knowledge flowed both ways. Standard Oil gained access to German chemical research. Germany gained access to American advances in fuel technology that it could not have developed as quickly on its own. This cooperation was legal, it was contractual, and it was decisive. One of the most critical technologies involved tetraethyl lead, an additive that dramatically improved aviation fuel performance. High-octane fuel was essential for modern air forces, allowing aircraft engines to deliver greater power and reliability. Through shared patents and technical collaboration, Germany gained access to methods that enhanced its aviation gasoline at a time when air superiority was becoming central to warfare. When the Luftwaffe struck Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, it did so with fuel refined through processes shaped by these international agreements. The Blitzkrieg was fast because it could move. It could move because it had fuel. And that fuel was the product of years of preparation. As war approached, direct cooperation became politically sensitive. But the flow of technology did not simply vanish. Licensing agreements already in place continued to operate. Patents already shared could not be recalled. Knowledge already transferred could not be unlearned. Investigations later revealed that some transactions and technical exchanges were routed through neutral countries, allowing cooperation to persist even as diplomatic tensions rose. These arrangements were not always illegal under U.S. law before December 1941, but they ensured that Germany's fuel program remained viable during the critical early years of the war. Without synthetic fuel, the German war machine would have stalled. Without foreign technology, synthetic fuel would not have scaled in time. During the war, American authorities began to understand what had happened. In 1942, a U.S. Senate investigation examined Standard Oil's pre-war agreements with IG Farben. Lawmakers questioned whether corporate decisions, made in pursuit of profit and patent control, had weakened U.S. national security by strengthening a future enemy. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Standard Oil had not violated the law as it existed at the time, but its actions had helped enable a regime preparing for war. The investigation produced reports, hearings, and public outrage, but no criminal convictions. Once again, legality and responsibility diverged. Germany ultimately lost the war, in large part because Allied bombing campaigns targeted synthetic fuel plants. When those facilities were destroyed, the Reich's mobility collapsed. Aircraft were grounded, tanks were abandoned, armies ran dry. That outcome revealed the truth retroactively. Fuel was the Reich's lifeline. Synthetic fuel was its workaround, and international business had helped build it. Standard Oil did not choose Nazi ideology. It chose to protect its patents, its market position, and its profits. In doing so, it helped power a war that would consume continents. When neutrality became a weapon, neutrality is often described as a moral position. In reality, it is usually an economic one. During the 1930s, American corporations insisted they were not choosing sides. They were not endorsing ideologies or supporting regimes. They were simply doing business in a global market that still believed another European war could be avoided. That belief was wrong. What these companies failed, or refused to acknowledge, was a fundamental shift in how war was fought. Modern warfare was no longer decided solely by generals and soldiers. It was decided by production capacity, logistics, and industrial integration. Factories were no longer separate from battlefields. Supply chains were no longer neutral. Technology was no longer passive. Every patent transferred, every production line optimized, every efficiency gained became part of a future war plan, whether its creators intended it or not. The Nazi regime understood this early. It did not need foreign companies to share its ideology. It only needed them to share their technology. Once that technology was embedded into Germany's industrial system, it ceased to belong to its creators. It became German. It became strategic. And eventually it became military. When war came, neutrality collapsed under its own weight. American executives could no longer claim ignorance. Governments could no longer pretend business had no consequences. And companies could no longer control what their infrastructure was used for. By the time the United States officially entered the war, the damage was already done. Germany had trucks to move its armies, fuel to keep them advancing, data systems to control populations behind the front lines. The only thing missing was scale. And that is where the next company enters the story, because no firm contributed more directly to Germany's ability to move, supply, and sustain its armies in the early years of the war than the American corporation that owned Opel. If fuel made the Blitzkrieg possible, vehicles made it real. Germany could plan wars, write doctrines, and train officers. But without trucks, those plans would stall at the border. Modern armies need constant movement: men, ammunition, food, spare parts. In the 1930s, no German company was better positioned to provide that mobility than Opel. And Opel belonged to an American corporation. General Motors acquired a controlling stake in Opel in 1929, during the depths of the Great Depression. For GM, it was a strategic move. Opel was Germany's largest automobile manufacturer, with modern plants and a skilled workforce. For Germany, it was a gift. American capital and management expertise poured directly into its industrial heart. By the early 1930s, Opel was the largest vehicle producer in Germany. When the Nazi regime began rearming, Opel stood ready. GM invested heavily in Opel's modernization, new assembly lines, advanced production techniques, and streamlined logistics. These were not military upgrades on paper, but they translated seamlessly into military capacity in practice. The most famous product of this system was the Opel Blitz truck. The Opel Blitz became the standard truck of the Wehrmacht. Simple, durable, and easy to maintain, it was produced in enormous numbers throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. These vehicles transported troops into Poland in 1939, rolled through France in 1940, and later carried supplies deep into the Soviet Union. Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, was not just a metaphor. It was logistics at speed. Opel trucks enabled rapid advances, flexible supply lines, and the coordination that made early German victories possible. Without them, the doctrine would have remained theory. GM did not design the Blitz as a weapon, but it built the factory that mass-produced it, and it perfected the system that kept production efficient. Throughout the 1930s, GM executives monitored Opel's performance closely. The subsidiary was profitable, technologically advanced, and deeply integrated into the German economy. Like Ford, Opel officially produced civilian vehicles before the war. But the line between civilian and military utility was meaningless once mobilization began. When war broke out in 1939, Opel plants were absorbed into the Nazi war economy almost overnight. Production priorities shifted. Military contracts dominated. Civilian output shrank. After December 1941, when the United States entered the war, GM lost direct control over Opel. But by then, control no longer mattered. The factories existed. The workforce was trained. The vehicles were already standard issue. After the war, General Motors submitted claims to the U.S. government for damages to Opel facilities caused by Allied bombing. Like Ford, GM argued that its foreign assets had been seized by the Nazi state and that it should be compensated for its losses. The claims were accepted. GM received millions of dollars in compensation for factories that, during the war, had supplied vehicles to the German army. The episode highlighted a recurring pattern. American corporations suffered financially from the war, but not legally or criminally. No trials followed. No executives faced charges. The story was categorized as unfortunate, but lawful business. General Motors was not alone. Another American company played a quieter, but strategically important role in Germany's war readiness. International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT. ITT held significant interests in German telecommunications firms before and during the early years of the Nazi regime. These companies were involved in communications infrastructure, networks essential for both civilian administration and military coordination. As with vehicles and fuel, communications technology blurred the line between civilian and military use. Phone networks, signal equipment, and industrial electronics became part of the command structure of modern war. Once installed, such systems could not simply be switched off. Across industries, automotive, energy, data, communications, the pattern repeated itself. American capital modernized German industry. American management improved efficiency. American technology became embedded in state infrastructure. None of this required ideological sympathy. None of it required secret agreements. It required only one belief: that business could remain separate from politics. By the time the Wehrmacht crossed Europe's borders, that belief was no longer defensible. The Reich did not build its war machine alone. It assembled it, piece by piece, using the tools of global capitalism. And once assembled, it moved with devastating speed. Union Banking Corporation, Wall Street, and trading with the enemy wars are fought with weapons. But they are prepared with money. Factories do not rise. Technologies do not scale. And armies do not mobilize without credit, insurance, and financial intermediaries willing to move capital across borders. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany needed access to international finance to rebuild its industrial base, and parts of that access ran through the United States. Not through secret cabals, not through ideology, through ordinary banking structures. One of the most documented cases involved the Union Banking Corporation, UBC, a New York-based bank incorporated in 1924. UBC was not a household name, but it played a specific role, managing assets connected to German industrial interests operating internationally. UBC was linked to financial structures associated with German steel magnate Fritz Thyssen, one of the early industrial supporters of Adolf Hitler. Thyssen's businesses were central to Germany's heavy industry, steel, coal, and manufacturing capacity essential for rearmament. Among UBC's directors was Prescott Bush, a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, one of the most influential investment banks in the United States at the time. The connection was not illegal. It was not hidden. It was recorded in corporate filings. Union Banking Corporation acted as a custodian and intermediary. It managed assets, facilitated transactions, and maintained financial continuity for German-linked industrial capital operating abroad. This did not mean American bankers were directing Nazi policy or financing concentration camps. It meant something more banal and more troubling. They helped keep industrial capital liquid. As Germany rearmed, heavy industry mattered more than ever. Steel production, machinery manufacturing, and industrial expansion required stable financial structures. International banks provided those structures, insulating assets from political shocks and allowing long-term planning. Money moved quietly. Paperwork replaced propaganda. Ledgers mattered more than speeches. The turning point came after the United States entered the war. In October 1942, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the U.S. government seized the assets of Union Banking Corporation. The bank was investigated for holding property on behalf of enemy nationals. This was not a symbolic action. It was a legal acknowledgement that neutrality had failed. The seizure did not allege treason. It did not accuse executives of war crimes. It stated something narrower and harder to dismiss, that American financial institutions had continued to manage enemy-linked assets during a global war. Prescott Bush and other directors were not charged with crimes. The assets were eventually released after the war, once ownership issues were resolved. Legally, the matter ended there. Historically, it did not. Union Banking Corporation was not unique. Throughout the interwar period, American banks extended credit to German firms, underwrote bonds and industrial expansion, facilitated international capital flows. Much of this occurred before Hitler's intentions were fully understood by the public, but not before his intentions were visible. The Nazi regime announced its goals openly: rearmament, territorial revision, and ideological purification. Financial institutions chose to treat these declarations as political noise, separate from balance sheets and profit margins. They were wrong. By the time governments reacted, the financial groundwork was complete. Industrial capacity had been restored. Supply chains had been financed. Technological partnerships had been monetized. What followed on the battlefield was only the final phase of a process that began in boardrooms and banks years earlier. No banker ordered an invasion. No balance sheet declared war. But without finance, there would have been no factories to convert, no trucks to deploy, no fuel to refine, and no data systems to manage an empire of occupation. Neutrality did not collapse because of ideology. It collapsed because industry had already become strategy. After Pearl Harbor, what changed and what didn't, December 7, 1941, ended the illusion. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, The United States was no longer a neutral observer. Within days, Washington moved to sever economic ties with the Axis. Contracts were canceled, assets were frozen, communications were cut. On paper, the rules changed overnight. In reality, the world did not reset. After America entered the war, U.S. law finally caught up with reality. Enemy-linked assets were seized. Financial intermediaries were investigated. Corporate headquarters in New York and Detroit lost control over subsidiaries operating in Germany and occupied Europe. But factories do not disappear because a cable is cut. Assembly lines kept running. Machines kept stamping metal. Workers kept showing up. Plants built with American capital and optimized with American methods were now fully absorbed into the German war economy. Ownership no longer mattered. Control no longer mattered. What mattered was capacity. The infrastructure was already there. The critical mistake had been made years earlier. The belief that future use could be separated from present investment. Once technology is transferred, it cannot be recalled. Once workers are trained, they do not forget. Once systems are integrated, they do not revert to neutrality. When American companies lost contact with their European subsidiaries, those subsidiaries did not shut down. They were seized, repurposed, and expanded under wartime directives. In some cases, production even increased. The Reich did not need permission anymore. It had what it needed. As the war progressed, the consequences became undeniable. Allied intelligence began mapping German industrial output. Bombing campaigns were designed not around ideology, but around capacity. Fuel plants, vehicle factories, rail hubs, communication centers. The targets revealed what truly mattered. When synthetic fuel facilities were destroyed, German aircraft were grounded. When transport factories were hit, supply lines broke. When data centers and communications were disrupted, coordination collapsed. The war proved what pre-war neutrality had obscured. Industry was not adjacent to warfare. It was central to it. After 1945, American corporations returned to a familiar position. They emphasized legality. They emphasized timelines. They emphasized loss of control. All of it was true. What they did not emphasize was foresight. No law required executives to ask how their technology might be used by a regime openly preparing for war. No statute demanded moral prediction. The system rewarded efficiency, growth, and market share, not restraint. History, however, applied a different standard. It measured consequences, not intentions. Pearl Harbor ended neutrality as a legal status. But neutrality had already failed as a strategy. By the time governments acted, the industrial groundwork of war was complete. The trucks were built. The fuel was refined. The data systems were operational. The money had moved. What followed on the battlefield was brutal and visible. What preceded it, in contracts, patents, and investments, remained largely invisible. Until now. Because understanding how war is prepared is the only way to prevent it from being prepared again. The cost of neutrality. No American company planned the Second World War. No boardroom voted for invasion. No contract mentioned genocide. And yet, when the war came, the machines were ready. They were ready because neutrality had been mistaken for innocence. In the decades before 1939, American corporations believed they could separate business from consequences. They believed that technology was neutral, that capital was blind, and that efficiency was a virtue, regardless of who used it. History proved otherwise. The Nazi state did not need foreign allies who shared its ideology. It needed partners who shared its appetite for growth, speed, and profit. Factories built for commerce became engines of war. Data systems designed for administration became tools of control. Financial structures, meant to stabilize markets, helped stabilize a regime preparing for conquest. None of this violated the law at the time. That is precisely the point. Legality lagged behind reality. By the time governments acted, The damage had already been done. Neutrality collapsed not because it was immoral, but because it was naive. After the war, the world focused on generals and politicians. It put men on trial, rewrote borders, and drafted new treaties. What it did not fully confront was the role of industry in making modern war possible. That lesson remains uncomfortable, because it suggests that the next war will not begin with a declaration. It will begin with investments, with partnerships, with technologies shared in the name of progress. History does not ask whether intentions were good. It asks what those intentions made possible. And the answer, in this case, is clear. War was not only fought on the battlefield, it was built, quietly, legally, and efficiently, long before the first shot was fired.